Philip II by William Thomas Walsh. Chapter 2. The Childhood of Philip, 1532. When Philip was 11 months old, in April 1528, he was taken before the Cortes of Castile to be acknowledged as heir to that ancient crown. The delegates, who had so recently refused money to an emperor warring against the Vicar of Christ, paid homage willingly to his tiny son. Maria, the companion of his first years, was born that year. 2 brothers died in infancy, both epileptic, as their father had been before, but not after his marriage. Another girl, Joanna, was born 7 years after Maria. The 3 surviving children were brought up under the vigilant eye of stately Donna Leonor de Mascarenhas, chief of the ladies who came from Portugal with the Empress. Philip was devoted to this excellent woman until the day of her death. His mother was not content to leave her children entirely in the hands of nurses and tutors. Even while ruling the empire in her husband's absence, she found time daily to watch them at play while her lovely hands worked at a piece of costly needlework for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem. She lived as simply as a private person, except on public occasions, when she would be very magnificent. After the birth of Philip and Maria, she was ill a great deal. Her face was frequently pale, her tapering fingers rather puffy at the tips. The emperor, frequently absent on the wars that carried him now to Germany, now to Africa, must have been a vague and remote personage, hence all the more heroic to his growing son. Philip was 2 years old when his father left Spain in 1529. They did not meet again for 4 years. Charles went to Italy to settle affairs there before undertaking his campaign against the Turk. The victory at Leyva at Landriano freed him from further fear of French interference in the north for some time to come. A blunder of Francis I had driven Juan Andrea Doria, Prince of Genoa, and his invaluable fleet from French to Spanish allegiance, and with them the mastery of the southern seas. Charles had released the Pope with a great show of respect, but had kept the military keys of Italy in his hands. By the Ladies' Peace of Cambrai in August 1529, he ended any serious claim of Francis to Italy, and by giving him his sister Eleanor in marriage, disarmed his rival for the time being, and acquired a useful ambassadress in Paris. There was always a flurry of excitement in the Spanish court when a courier came with letters from the emperor. As Philip grew, he learned from his mother's lips of the wars and journeys by which his father was creating the situations that he himself later on would have to face. The correspondence of Charles with his wife was cool, detached and formal, as became their position, and usually gave brief summaries of recent events and instructions. From Genoa, for example, he wrote, August 30th, "To the most high and mighty Empress and Queen, our dear and beloved wife, that he intended going to Piacenza as soon as the army was assembled, and hoped to meet the Pope there. As for the Dauphin and Duke Henry of Orleans, later Henry II, he wanted those sons of Francis I, still hostages in Spain, to be strictly watched, and to be allowed to speak with no one except in the presence of the Constable of Castile or his brother. They were to have 4,000 ducats a year for their common expenses." December 6th. Efforts to save the unity of Europe and of the faith were vain, for the Lutherans refused to take part in a general council for the reform of the Church. Italy, thank God, is peaceful now. True, we are occasionally troubled by the Spanish infantry, 5,000 or 6,000 in all, who are so undisciplined that they are continually mutinying and creating disturbance. But we have now a treaty with the Pope as to how and where they are to be quartered, and as soon as the money to pay their arrears shall be collected, they are to march to the frontiers of Hungary. Charles had asked Clement VII to permit the sale of all immovable property of the Church in the Netherlands for 300,000 ducats, to furnish money to fight the Turks in Hungary, but the Pope had refused. The news from Germany was discouraging. It was bad enough that the Lutherans had set up their independent churches, and the Zwinglians likewise. The Anabaptists were striking at the foundation of all order by advocating ownership of all property in common. The Pope was ill so often that summer that he was not expected to live long. He was 10 days well and 8 ill, wrote the Cardinal of Santa Croce to Charles's counsellor Cobos. People generally believe that he will hardly live till September, for they consider it certain that he has drunk the papal medicine, which generally has its effect after the hot weather. The Holy Father's enemies were disappointed, however, to find him still alive in the autumn and capable of being very annoying. In the following February, 1530, he went to Bologna to place the iron crown of the Lombards on the head of Charles V, as his predecessors had placed it centuries before on the heads of Charlemagne and Barbarossa. He did it with such obvious reluctance that his sighs were overheard by those about him and duly reported at the court of Spain. Charles was again insisting upon a general council for the reform of the church. A year ago he had promised to say nothing more about a council if Clement would agree to his terms of peace. Now that the treaty had been signed, he resumed his requests. Early in 1530, Clement wrote him a long letter giving his reasons for not calling a council. The Pope felt that at that particular time it would do more harm than good. He cited examples of heretics in the past who had used councils for their own ends and to the injury of the church rather than its reform. The Lutherans, Zwinglians, Anabaptists, and other heretics now roaring for reform in Germany and squabbling among themselves at the same time were the most obstinate heretics the church had ever had to deal with. Clement said he feared that they would leave the council, if indeed they attended it, and then denounce it as ineffectual. Many thoughtful Catholics believed that the Pope was right, instancing the fact, which is hardly deniable, that the Lutherans and others, for all their insistence on reform, threw every possible obstacle in the way whenever a concrete proposal for a council was made. Others feared that Clement underestimated the force and potentialities of Protestantism and the need of meeting it with a thorough reformation of all the scandals which gave it an excuse for existing. It was surely unjust to say, as the Emperor and others did at various times, that Clement did not wish the church to be reformed. In November of that year he wrote Charles that he would consult the cardinals on the subject. In December he added that he had written all Christian princes and was making preparation for the council. But in almost everything save his devotion to the interests of the Medici, he was timid and variable. Just as his cousin, Pope Leo X, had allowed the Battle of the Books to grow into the Lutheran schism and heresy when he might have preserved the unity of Christendom by intelligent and vigorous action, so now the second Medici Pope, in his anxiety to conduct a difficult case fairly, as spiritual father to both the persons concerned, was allowing the English affair to get out of hand. Meanwhile, the Lutherans were converting an heretical opinion, which might have yielded to a general council, into a permanent political entity, out of which time would hatch monstrosities not to be fully revealed for centuries. Charles, triumphant over France, Italy, and the Pope, crossed the Austrian Alps in May of 1530 and proceeded to visit a Germany that had changed as much as he had since he held the Diet of Worms 9 years before. The phlegmatic boy had become at 30 the most able ruler of his day. Germany, from being infected by clerical laxity and a monkish squabble, had become a menace to Christendom comparable only to Islam. Charles now desired his brother King Ferdinand to annul his concession of 1526, in virtue of which the Lutherans built their independent churches. But the Lutherans, provided with material resources by the loot of churches and monasteries, could now afford to adopt an attitude of open hostility. When Charles reached Augsburg, with every desire to meet all legitimate demands of his Protestant subjects, he found them aloof and scornful to his invitation to join him in the traditional Corpus Christi procession. Lutheran princes and Zwinglian burghers uttered coarse jibes at the church and the Blessed Sacrament, while the young emperor, bareheaded in a brown velvet tunic, walked for 2 hours in the burning June sun behind the uplifted host. Both Luther and Melanchthon praised Charles's moderation, his control of his temper, his patience and charity at the Diet, but his 2 requests were denied. He asked first that the Protestants join with the Catholics in repelling the Turks, who were the enemies of all Christians. Second, that an effort be made to reach an agreement on the religious disputes. The Protestants insisted on settling the disputes first. This they would gladly do, they protested, if it were not for the Pope's reluctance to hold a council. But whenever some concrete proposal for a council was offered them, they found further objections to the time, the place, the programme. It was becoming painfully evident to Charles and to some other Catholics that what they had to deal with was not merely a desire for the needed reform of the Church, but the expression of an obscure spirit seeking other ends of its own. Charles failed, therefore, to conciliate the Protestants. He then considered using force against them. Such was the course urged by his brother Ferdinand, by Cardinal Campeggio, and by the Pope. It was suggested that Charles use his Italian army, newly replenished, in Germany, but he lacked the necessary money. The Germans undoubtedly would resist. Lutherans were saying that they would rather have Germany Turkish than Catholic. Charles himself seems to have agreed with the opinion of his confessor, Loyasa, that it was better to wink at the German heresies for the moment and to drive the Turk out of Eastern Europe. In 1532 he was able to concentrate his Spanish and Italian veterans in Vienna and to force the Grand Turk Soliman, already worried about the incursions of Doria's fleet in the Ionian Isles, to withdraw before him. The following year he was able to reorganize Italy, avoiding troublesome annexations and placing his relatives on various thrones so skillfully that he formed a family alliance of the most effective sort and avoided the mistakes that Machiavelli had attributed to Louis XII. This was all very well for Spain, but the Pope was no more enthusiastic about having the liberties of the Church and of Italy trampled by a greater Spain than by a greater France. He was driven, therefore, by the success of Charles to seek a balance of power favourable to Italy in a new alliance with France, to the disgust of the Spaniards. He went to Marseille to meet Francis. A Turkish representative of the notorious pirate Barbarossa was present. If the Pope did not come to terms with him, it is certain from later events that the French king did. At that portentous meeting, Clement agreed on the marriage of his young niece, Catherine de' Medici, to the second French prince, Duke Henry of Orleans, and so prepared a Medician legacy for France in the troubled years to come. Meanwhile, the Empress had been taking Philip and Maria from place to place, seeking safety from the plagues that were current. When they left Madrid early in the spring of 1531, Philip, not quite 4 years old, was ill. His tutor, Don Pedro González de Mendoza, was able to report his recovery to the Emperor on April 13th from Ocana. Mendoza's account does not lend much support to the melancholy complaint of Prescott that, in Philip's childhood, at no time did he discover that buoyancy of spirit, or was he betrayed into those sallies of temper which belong to a bold and adventurous, and often to a generous nature. His deportment was marked by a seriousness that to some might seem to savour of melancholy. But it does suggest a rather ordinary little boy, whom nobody would expect to grow up into any sort of monster, gloomy or otherwise. A lady asked the little prince to accept a certain boy as his page. Don Felipe, unwilling to do so, replied that he had many. Asked again, he said, no, he couldn't take the boy. Give him to my sister, she hasn't any. But she can't have pages so soon, they told him. She's too young. Philip, annoyed, said, then look for some other prince. You'll find some around these streets. The faithful tutor assured the emperor that there are so many witnesses of this that your majesty can well believe it. Philip's favourite pastime, he continued, was to order the other boys to hold jousts with burned candles for lances. Dr. Villalobos, one of the physicians of the royal family, put a stop to that, to the great displeasure of the prince, who was further put out because he was not allowed to eat all he wanted. He is so mischievous that several times Her Majesty has been exceedingly put out with him, and he has had blows of her hand. Mendoza found the spanking of the prince amusing, and evidently thought the emperor would too. Some of the ladies of the court, he added slyly, wept to see such cruelty. But the emperor would rejoice if he could see how much fun the prince's antics gave to the empress and the whole household. Little Maria, too, was growing fast and gaining weight every day. She is planning to have a ball when she is 20 years old, and the prince entertains her like a gallant little gentleman, como gentil galante. May it please our Lord that your majesty see them soon and enjoy them many years, for two such creatures have never been seen. The incredulity with which your majesty is accustomed to hear such things is the reason why no one dares tell what they say, but one could do so at length if one had permission. His Highness has no trace of the illness with which he left Madrid, and is stouter and stronger. He knows the characteristics of the persons who serve him as if he were more than 10 years old, and has good times with Her Majesty. In April the Empress was ill, but recovered her health at Aranjuez. The prince was with Her Majesty and rode on his little mule all alone, and did it very well. He eats and sleeps better in the country than in the city. They could not make him enter the carts with Her Majesty. He desired that they fetch the Lady Infanta. The Empress left Ocaña after the middle of May, and proceeded towards Avila, noted for its vivifying air and general health. When the royal travellers approached Toledo, the people came forth with joy to receive them, and when they were leaving, followed them with benedictions, laughing with delight to see young Philip riding a machijo pequeño, or small ass. He vigorously protested when they tried to seat him in the saddle sideways, and insisted that he must have his feet in the stirrups like a man. So many people came to see him that one could hardly pass through the streets, wrote Mendoza to the emperor. He was saying funny things to Her Majesty, and was very joyful to see himself cavalgado. On one side of him walked Mendoza, holding him in the saddle. On the other, also afoot, was a handsome young cavalier in his 20s, one of the gayest and most popular men of the court, the emperor's most intimate friend, the Marquess of Lombay, to whom special care he had committed the empress and her children in his absence. The Marquess of Lombay was the eldest son and heir of the Duke of Gandia, grandson on his father's side of the favourite son of Pope Alexander VI, and grandson on his mother's side of one of the bastards of Ferdinand the Catholic. He had later made a brilliant marriage with the much-sought Eleanor de Castro. 4 years before this, riding through Alcalá de Henares, he had seen a poor man from Loyola on his way to one of the prisons of the Inquisition, and had cast after him a look of sympathy. He would meet that man again. As he walked beside the machico of the tiny heir to half the world, and laughed with the crowd at his precocious sayings, no one could have imagined, least of all perhaps the debonair Lombay, that the future St. Francis Borgia was walking that day over the cobbles on the steep, narrow streets of Toledo. At Illescas, Mendoza wrote the emperor an account of their reception at Toledo. As it was then May 20th, the eve of Philip's birthday, he added that the prince had just gone out to a church to offer up his years to God. They are 4, but he looks older. The empress was grieved because the couriers were late, and especially because there was no news that the emperor was returning to Spain. They continued over the rolling sandy waste, checkered with farms and orchards by the riverbeds, until late in the afternoon of the 24th, they came within sight of Avila, that holy and terrible city. As the imperial cortege approached from the east, for at that time there was only one entrance, it must have lain mostly in its own shadow, tier on tier of white buildings, rising above the girdle of machicolated wall to an uneven fiery crown of convent towers and Gothic spires, all darkening now against the flaming magnificence of the sunset. 3,000 feet above sea level, Avila seemed to be almost a part of the brilliant sky. As the tired empress looked up towards the favourite refuge, it seemed to burst from colour into music. Children came forth dancing to the sound of many minstrels, while welcoming fires leaped up along the shoulder of the hill. During the 4 months of that visit, and his many subsequent ones, a boy of 4 must have received impressions of the most vivid and lasting character. The city at that time boasted 127 streets, and a population of perhaps 5,000, most of them poor and industrious, artisans, wool-workers, cloth-weavers, and the like. The middle class was small, the nobility few, but of great antiquity and esteem. Above all, it was a place of religion. In its churches, convents, and shrines were priceless mementos and relics, in whose traditions and history might almost be traced the whole marvellous adventure of Christianity, from apostolic times through the bloody persecutions of the Roman emperors to the triumphant end of 8 centuries of a struggle for freedom against the invading Moors. In the Gothic cathedral, dating from the 11th century, was the body of the martyred Bishop San Segundo, which had been found that very year, 1531, and was much venerated. In the famous Dominican monastery of St. Thomas, one could see the resting place of Torquemada and the right arm of St. Thomas Aquinas, with that hand he had once used to startle an emperor by pounding a table. In this church was preserved also the consecrated host, stolen, desecrated, and recovered, and still intact after 40 years, of the celebrated La Guardia case. This host had been especially venerated since the Great Plague of 1519. The Royal Council of Castile had come to Avila, hoping to find immunity in its fine air, but the pitiless enemy followed them, and people were dying in appalling numbers. Finally, the host of La Guardia was carried in solemn procession from the church of San Tomás to the cathedral, and adored there day and night for a week. It was then returned to San Tomás, and the Lord in his mercy heard the fervent prayers of the Avilenses, for in a little while the city found itself cleansed. Through all the rest of Spain, the pest continued to rage for 3 years. The Empress, like her grandmother, was fond of visiting convents, shrines, and churches, and spent much time in embroidering tapestries for favourite places of worship. She imitated La Católica also in giving dowries to poor girls so that they could marry or enter religion. On August 24th of that year, she took Philip to the convent of St. Anne to see the reception of 3 of her own maidens. In that very house, the great Isabel had once refused the crown of Castile. The occasion was a grand one. Many notables of the city and the court were present. After the Empress had eaten in the refectory, the prince was solemnly divested of his skirts and arrayed de corto to symbolize his complete emergence from the state of babyhood. In his new dignity, the boy was presented by his mother to the nobles and clergy, and to the waiting populace outside, who cheered him and made much of him. Only a month before this, a girl of 16, named Teresa de Alhumida, who had dreamed as a child of going to Africa to be killed by the Mohammedans, had entered the convent of Our Lady of Grace a short distance away. The event was just as important, in a way, as the one at St. Anne's, but it passed almost unnoticed. On September 26th, the Empress and her children started on their way back across the rolling Vega. It was no very secure or tranquil world for which they were leaving the Holy Mount and the happy Avelinces. Halley's comet was seen in August and September of that year, and men said it meant no good. Now and then came a gossipy but impersonal letter from the Emperor. It was not true, he said, that the Turks had reached Buda, for the overflowing of the Danube had stopped them. He was marching east to meet them. Many gentlemen from all parts of Europe, but especially from the Spanish dominions, were joining him on the way. Yes, he was well aware of the financial difficulties in Spain, but I must insist on having the money I asked for. The Empress must instruct all churches and convents to say daily prayers for the delivery of Christendom from the most dreadful scourge that ever has fallen upon it. The frontiers of France must be carefully watched. I, the King. Not until April 1533 did Charles return to Spain. The joy of the Empress was great, but within a month she had become seriously ill, and several times her life was almost despaired of. By July she was out of danger, and Pope Clement sent his congratulations. It was during these long weeks of wonder and anxiety that Philip, 6 years old, first became acquainted with the overpowering personality of his father, a personality that was to be so important a factor in his own career. The Emperor was well pleased with him, but thought it nearly time to separate him from his family, especially from the influence of so many women, and to make a man of him. The first step was to find the right sort of tutor. The Empress had just the man in mind, Dr. Juan Martinez Silicio, theologian of Alcala, now professor at Salamanca. The Emperor frowned on that suggestion. A Fleming himself by birth, he had no great love for Spaniards, nor they for him and his entourage. He could understand the familiar, ostentatious, and hearty gluttons of Flanders, as they were considered in Castile, but these grave and reserved Castilians, who seemed to eat and drink only to keep their souls in their lean bodies, eluded him. Besides, as he reminded the Empress, the prince was to be something more than King of Spain. He would be ruler of the Netherlands and Burgundy, and, if elected Emperor, as doubtless he would be, of all the Germanies. Would it be wise to bring him up so much a Spaniard that he would be unable to understand his northern subjects? Charles decided on one of the most famous scholars of the Netherlands, a young and brilliant Fleming named Dr. Vigilius ab Aeta Zoichimus, and sent him forthwith an invitation to come to Spain and take charge of His Highness's education. Zoichimus declined on the score of humility. It is interesting to conjecture how different the history of the world might have been if Dr. Vigilius had accepted the post. No one quite as suitable being found, the Empress had her way. Dr. Silicio became Don Felipe's tutor, at a salary of 100,000 maravedis per year. He was kind, industrious, patient, pious, more learned than intelligent. The Emperor never thought much of him. He used to grumble that Silicio was too easy with the boy. Philip liked Silicio, perhaps for the same reason, and from him he learned to love and fear God, to read, to write, to do mathematics, and in this he excelled, the Latin tongue and Italian and French, to read and to understand in conversation, but never to speak fluently. Philip, at 7, had a house of his own under the shadow of the university at Salamanca. He had his own servants, his own counsellors, his own companions, carefully chosen to bring out the qualities a king would need. His cousin Maximilian, son and heir of the emperor's brother, King Ferdinand, was brought from Vienna to be educated with him. Maximilian was a typical German, hearty, talkative, and boisterous, a year younger than Philip. They played and studied together, but there was always a coolness between them. Philip preferred Rui Gomes de Silva, a Portuguese boy 5 years older than he, who had come from the West as a page in the household of the Empress. He understood Rui Gomes. When one told him anything, he did not go around shouting it. With these and other noble boys, Philip held his court, and gravely discussed the affairs of Spain and of the world. At this time he was a thin, rather pale, wiry boy with long yellow hair. The resemblance to his mother was more apparent in the lower part of the face. The full lips, at once sensitive and sensuous, were, like hers, the upper part of the face, more like the emperor's. There was a hardness, a ruthlessness in Charles that manifested itself in his son only occasionally, and probably in violence to his real nature. Philip inherited most of his father's finer tastes. He loved flowers all his life, even in his 50s. In the midst of a campaign, he still had an eye for the best roses, and watched for the first jonquils to appear. Painting delighted him. He is said to have tried his hand at it. In any case, he became, even as a boy, an able connoisseur of Italian and Flemish art. An attempt has been made to attribute a poem to him, but on rather slender evidence. He loved and understood music. His hearing, like his eyesight, was unusually keen. Although he never could sing, he played on the guitar. He was thoroughly familiar, as his father was, with the liturgy of the church, and could pronounce a good critical opinion on a new mass. Even when he didn't know the music or what the pitch of the voice was, he judged it shrewdly, says Cabrera. Few men in Europe knew more about architecture. Born in more humble circumstances, he might have been an artist, for in childhood he was surrounded by objects of beauty, rare tapestries, flowers from the choice gardens at Aranjuez, jewels of royal lustre and magnificence, Venetian glass, Moorish pottery, subtle work in gold and silver, the most brilliant and skillfully woven cloths in the world. On summer nights, when the nightingales sang in the perfumed gardens of the royal palace at Madrid, he would lie awake listening with joy to the sad, ecstatic music. Such a boy, born a prince, with more taste than creative energy, might easily have become an aesthete and a dilettante. He was of good but not great disposition, says Cabrera, of sanguine temperament, with a middling mixture of melancholy to moderate the lofty motion of the blood. The dangers of such a combination of humours, as Philip seemed to possess, were fairly obvious, and the emperor took steps to offset them. The good Dr. Salizio was not to have exclusive control of his royal pupil. His work was to be complemented by that of Don Juan de Zuniga, member of the Council of State and Comendador Mayor of Castile, a soldier noted for his blunt frankness, a nobleman of the highest caste of that ancient aristocracy which boasted of its limpieza, master of all the niceties of court etiquette, and punctilio. Zuniga's function was to teach Philip the graces of a gentleman, to ride, to fence, to hunt, to dress elegantly but without vulgar ostentation, to know what his honour and position demanded. His blunt speech sometimes offended the shy and sensitive prince. "If he deals plainly with you," wrote the emperor to Philip, "it is for the love he bears you. If he were to flatter you and be only solicitous of ministering to your wishes, he would be like all the rest of the world, and you would have no one near you to tell you the truth. And a worse thing cannot happen to any man, old or young, but most of all to the young, from their want of experience to discern the true from the false." The extraordinary memory of Philip's later years seems to have been cultivated with much labour. One of Dr. Salizio's frequent reports to the emperor noted that "the study of the prince, as far as grammar is concerned, has been somewhat slow, for it has been difficult for him to memorize. But now, thank God, he is showing more effort and improvement, for he is already beginning to enjoy the artificio of grammar. In most matters pertaining to health and virtuous conversation, one can say that he grows better each day, and gives much satisfaction to those whom he converses. The Infanta has lagged behind the prince in reading, but in writing she does better than he." This was in July 1536, when Philip was 9, and convalescing from smallpox, which had stricken him in May. Shortly after this he was taken to Valladolid, where he fully recovered and finished learning his conjugations. He was now ready to begin reading some Latin author. The first, if your majesty pleases, will be Cato, who is very lucid in what he says, and has maxims most necessary for human life, wrote Silicio. The Infanta goes on improving each day, though she does not take to literature as her brother does. Zuniga also had favourable reports to make on the physical side of the prince's education. The prince improves in everything, he wrote from Valladolid that summer. We are looking for horses for his highness, with the qualities your majesty demands. Meanwhile, he is riding on a large pony of her majesty, which is quite gentle and well formed. Several observers noted in Philip at this time a great natural dignity, so much so, says Cabrera, that when some rustics saw him in a wood, not knowing who he was, they saluted him with reverence. One looks in vain through contemporary accounts of Philip's boyhood for some of the qualities attributed to him by the great authorities of later centuries. Major Hume, and what do we not owe to his splendid researches, tells us that he was uncosmopolitan, cold, reserved, preternaturally grave and silent, a grave and moody prince. He was a Spaniard of the Spaniards, and nothing shows the strict limitations of his capacity more than the clumsiness with which he expressed himself even in his own language. Prescott affirms, in the paragraph already cited, that he slowly unfolded the peculiar qualities of his disposition. He seemed cautious and reserved in his demeanour and slow of speech, yet what he said had a character of thought beyond his age. He was self-possessed, so that even as a boy he was rarely off his guard. Here we have a preliminary hint of the black demon of the South, the heretic burner, the foe of liberty, as it were, in embryo. To Professor Merriman of Harvard, Philip is cold, reserved, grave, melancholy, uncosmopolitan, trusts no one, patient and industrious, but a slave to detail, slow and delayful, superstitious and ignorant. And though he seemed at first sight to be rather a Fleming than a Spaniard, he was a typical product of Spain, whose ancestry was predominantly Iberian. Further, he was subjected to ecclesiastical influences, as though such influences were necessarily evil or onerous, and the influence of the Empress was also a potent cause of Philip's proverbial respect for the clergy, as though the Spanish priests might not have had qualities which commanded respect of their own account. Finally, Philip's routine of etiquette was so strict that it was scarcely possible for him to laugh. There seems to be an assumption here that a typically Spanish education of the 16th century must perforce have been more narrow, gloomy, restricting, incompetent than, say, the French Calvinistic education of Anne Boleyn, or the German Lutheran education of Philip of Hesse. Yet Spanish education was Catholic education, and Catholic education has never been gloomy. Moreover, the most cosmopolitan force in Europe at that time was, obviously, the Catholic Church, the only cosmopolitan force in the world, in fact, with the sole exception, perhaps, of the foul spirit that sought to destroy Christianity. Spain was then the cultural centre of the world, as Greece, Imperial Rome, and medieval Italy had been. At the moment when the Catholic Renaissance perished in Italy under the iron heels of Charles's Lutheran and Mohammedan soldiers, its transplanted seed was beginning to burgeon in Spain with an extraordinary energy. Salamanca, where Philip began his studies, was called the New Athens. Spanish musical study would presently flower in Philip's protégé Vittoria, so profoundly to influence the art of Bach. Spanish science, the most advanced in the world, was on the eve of anticipating the telescope of Galileo and the synthesis of Bacon. Spanish literature would presently exert its influence upon English and French letters, giving to Shakespeare some of his situations, and among his characters the blustering pistol, who hanged for desecrating a sacred object, might have been taken from the gallery of Juan de Encina and modelled after one of those Lutheran swashbucklers who looted the Vatican, and Cervantes would give impetus to modern fiction. From Spain, the Jesuits would presently go to roll back the tide of Protestantism and to establish schools so famous in the Netherlands that even Jews and Lutherans would send their children to them. It is true that the Spanish imagination, the Spanish genius, the whole range of Spanish study and activity were orientated and integrated by the central influence of the Catholic Church. To the logical Spanish mind, it would have seemed a strange thing to call an education more cosmopolitan or more universal, because it deliberately excluded the institution that had moulded Western civilization, to regret being subjected to an orderly body of thinking based upon the divine teachings of Christ, or principles deduced from them by the authority he had established for that purpose. Above all, to plume oneself on being realistic in leaving out of account an important part of man's nature, the moral, and in shrinking one's concept of reality to the material, excluding God and the spirit. If Spaniards could have seen all this at the end of the road Luther had marked out, it would have seemed to them sheer insanity. If Philip had a natural tendency to melancholy, his education served to restrain it rather than to increase it. It remains a fair question whether he was as gloomy and as reserved as he had been painted, or more grave than his station required. Both parents impressed upon him the great responsibility of preparing himself to rule. Yet there is much evidence that the emperor and empress laughed frequently and easily, despite the weight of their own dignity. Charles roared with merriment whenever he pleased. Isabel could laugh about a rustic wagon. How did solemn historians come to imagine that such parents could deliberately encourage a preternatural gravity in their only son and heir? The truth is that a boy who liked birds, flowers, and music, rode horseback and played on the guitar, hated grammar but mastered it, danced with gusto and appeared to enjoy it, and took great delight in the antics of clowns and buffoons. Even in middle age, weighed by cares, he would find time to write an amusing account of a garrulous old servant in her cups, and to play little jokes on his children, was not so different from ordinary boys of all times and places. Was Philip such a typical Spanish product, as so many estimable gentlemen of an alien and a rival culture like to believe? Consider his family tree. His Iberian ancestors were descended on both sides from the English House of Lancaster. No one has ever called his father anything but northern in type. His grandfather, Philip the Fair, was surely a Germanic specimen of the Habsburgs. In appearance, young Prince Philip was definitely northern rather than southern. Add to his blonde hair and blue eyes the reserve noted in him, a certain especial devotion to the country of his birth, a distaste for strange and foreign customs, but a love for Italian painting, and some awkwardness with foreign tongues, and one is tempted to say that there emerges something like the traditional portrait of a typical Englishman. But some pontifical authority, writing for a generation of men in whom had been stimulated an artificial hatred of Spain and Spaniards, wrote, "He was a typical Spaniard," and all was explained. Any crime to be attributed to him would be easily understood by the well-meaning English reader. Philip's education in the science of politics began early, and under no less a preceptor than his father, a consummate master in the field. When the emperor was at home, he spent 2 hours a day with his son. If Silizio taught him his littleness before God, Charles impressed upon him his importance as a royal person, and the respect owing to his position. One might also say his greatness before God and men. There were still persons living in Spain who remembered that disrespect for the king's person had almost ruined the country, and that Ferdinand and Isabel had rebuilt its peace and prosperity on the foundation of a strong popular monarchy, venerated and obeyed. It must have delighted Charles to hear that his son had put on his hat and said quietly to Cardinal Tabarera, "Now you may put on your bonnet, Cardinal." Part of a king's business was to make his authority feared and respected. And so, as Cabrera says, the time had come to study the affairs of war, peace, history, how to be strong in adversity, and modest in prosperity, the sure understanding of divine things, that he might not have reason to fear superstition or plunge into license. About the time when Zuniga reported to the emperor that his son had just kept a wild boar at bay, alone on horseback, and had then dispatched him with a sword, the boy was making a study of his provinces, cities, peoples, mountains, rivers, commodities, civil and military affairs, government, business, commerce, and taxes. The impulsive, affectionate, rather timid and sickly boy was being trained to use his will in spite of all obstacles, to act according to principles and not according to passion. The ideas which were to dominate his later life were already clearly in his mind. They were the ideas of his father, even if the emperor displayed some human inconsistency and frailty in their application. Not all of them were accepted by the Church Catholic, and some were violently disputed in certain parts of Christendom. They were substantially as follows. 1. God made and rules the world. He sent his Son into the world to show men the only way to salvation. Christ established the Catholic Church to perpetuate his work on earth. Therefore, mankind could find no genuine peace, prosperity, and happiness except within the framework of that international society, the Church Catholic. 2. Christ did not intend the Church to be a civil society, else why render unto Caesar? 3. However, since the Church is divine, no state can be normal and healthy if at variance with the Church. Each must support the other in all good efforts, each respecting the sphere of the other. 4. Most of the nations that had risen with the breakdown of feudal power had pillaged, betrayed, corrupted, and neglected the Church. France, the eldest daughter of the Church, was notorious in this respect, a very goneril. 5. Castile alone, with few and slight exceptions, had always placed the welfare of Christ's Church before her own selfish interests. In an intermittent crusade lasting nearly 8 centuries, Spaniards had shed their blood for Christ and had triumphed only by establishing a strong monarchy for all of Spain. This new Spain had then sent Columbus to discover a new world explicitly for the spread of Christianity. The new Spanish Federation, dominated by Castile, was the chief defender and sword of the Church. 6. The maintenance of the Spanish royal authority was as important to the welfare of the Church as to the Spanish people. All this was so obvious to Charles that even at 21, after listening patiently to Luther at Worms, he had applied it to Germany in a written memorandum as follows. My predecessors, the most Christian emperors of German race, the Austrian archdukes and dukes of Burgundy, were until death the truest sons of the Catholic Church, defending and extending their belief to the glory of God, the propagation of the faith, the salvation of their souls. They have left behind them the holy Catholic rites, that I should live and die therein, and so until now, with God's aid, I have lived, as becomes a Christian emperor. What my forefathers established at Constance and other councils, it is my privilege to uphold. A single monk, led astray by private judgment, has set himself against the faith held by all Christians for 1,000 years and more, and impudently concludes that all Christians up to now have erred. I have therefore resolved to stake upon this cause all my dominions, my friends, my body and my blood, my life and my soul. For myself and you, sprung from the holy German nation, appointed by peculiar privilege, defenders of the faith, it would be a grievous disgrace, an eternal stain upon ourselves and our posterity, if in this our day not only heresy, but its very suspicion were due to our neglect. After Luther's stiff-necked reply in my presence yesterday, I now repent that I have so long delayed proceedings against him and his false doctrines. I have now resolved never again, under any circumstances, to hear him. Under protection of his safe conduct, he shall be escorted home, but forbidden to preach and to seduce men with his evil doctrines, and incite them to rebellion. I warn you to give witness to your opinion as good Christians, and in accordance with your vows. Charles had seen clearly at that time that, in Luther's teaching, there was at work a yeast that would grow and multiply, breaking down all forms of authority, one after another, both religious and political, until, if possible, there remained over mankind only the authority of absolute evil. For what else could be the end of the repudiation of God's Church? But Charles, partly from force of circumstances, and partly through his own neglect, had temporized with the revolt in the north. Now, when he was becoming fully awake to the extent of the danger, the situation was far more complicated. He could no longer teach his growing son that, as soon as the Turks were beaten, the silly followers of the German monk dispersed, and Francis I put in his place for good and for all, everything would be comparatively well with Christendom. A Christendom protected for its own good by victorious Spain and her empire. Terrible and unexpected things were happening in England. Luther would live to see his work of division completed by one of his bitterest enemies, and the whole life of Philip II would be different because an English king had looked too long into a pair of dark eyes.